good afternoon to you guys. It's a good evening to me, but I'm actually coming to you guys from Budapest. So I'm really happy to have this presentation with you all and maybe have a nice little discussion afterwards. So a brief introduction about me. My name, of course, is Stephen Sholl. I'm an American researcher currently working in Hungary. I've been in Hungary on and off since September of last year. So I've now been here a little over a year. And in this capacity, I've done a lot of research in understanding the political system and cultural system in place in Hungary. And so that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about today. Because as some of you may be aware, I think it's becoming more and more known, Hungary is now becoming a household name, especially when we're talking about conservatism. Sometimes in a good way, a lot of times in a bad way. So I think it's an important area to discuss, especially since right now, assuming the majority of you probably do identify as conservative, the conservative movement's in flux. Since the election of Donald Trump, there has been a massive redefining of what it means to be conservative. And that process is still not completed. When we're looking at the potential candidates for president of next year, they still vary on ideology. A lot of them don't agree with each other. And eventually, we'll hopefully find out by 2024 what ideology the Republicans will coalesce around. I think it's always important to look at other countries, and in this case, Hungary, and understand what is their conservative ideology, and is this something that could work for America as we kind of try and do our soul searching and discovering, what it means to be a conservative. What are we actually trying to conserve? So with that, I have a small PowerPoint I'm going to begin with. So I'm actually going to really be more talking about European conservatism rather than Hungarian conservatism, because as I'm going to show, Hungarian conservatism is actually just a really successful example of European conservatism. So when we're discussing Hungarian conservative, of course, there are unique ideas to Hungary in and of itself, but in a large part, the ideology espoused by the right wing in Hungary is actually really just part of a larger branch of conservatism that is found in the European tradition. So really, instead of talking about Hungarian conservatism, I'm going to be talking about European conservatism and show how the current Hungarian government and its policies really do reflect this larger and broader ideology of European conservatism. So what do we mean by European conservatism? It's impossible to discuss this without talking about Roger Scrutin. For those who don't know him, he is definitely a name to know. He was a British philosopher, historian, a truly Renaissance man who unfortunately died at the beginning of 2020, right before the COVID outbreak. He didn't die of COVID, unfortunately died of a rather malignant cancer. But while he may have died a year ago, his ideas continue to really define European conservatism. So throughout this PowerPoint, I'm really trying to talk about European conservatism through their own words. So I'm going to be using a lot of quotes from these leaders because I think it's much easier to kind of hear it directly from them rather than me explain secondhand, what they mean. So I took this quote from one of Roger Scrutin's bigger books, is How to Be a Conservative. In it, he describes, whatever our religion and our private convictions, we are the collective inheritors of things both excellent and rare. And political life for us ought to have one overriding goal, which is to hold fast to those things in order to pass them on to our children. So if you notice here, he is kind of describing, for at least European conservatives, one, what their aim is, and really more precisely, what are we actually trying to conserve? Because, as I'm going to talk a little bit in the next slide, if you ask people, what it means to be a conservative, you might get a lot of different answers. To someone, being a conservative means fiscal responsibility. For another one, it means the free market. For someone else, it means being able to do whatever I want as long as it doesn't hurt someone else. But for Roger Scrutin, being conservative actually really means holding on to these excellent and rare values passed down from our ancestors. So essentially what he's arguing is conservatives' goals need to be understanding the good things that our parents have given us and hold on to them in an attempt to preserve them for the future. And in specific, you probably hear this a lot. He always identified them as things that are true, good, and beautiful. And then those are the things conservatives need to conserve. everything that is true, good, and beautiful. So now let's kind of compare this to American conservatism. So one, a couple of you guys may look at this and be like, that's not me. I'm not this American conservatism. As I'm talking about the movements in flux, so by no means when I'm talking about this American conservatism, I mean this is the definitive list. But I think most of this is kind of the traditional, probably pre-Trump traditional American conservatism. So please take this with a grain of salt. I'm not trying to put these views on Americans or myself, because I certainly don't hold many of them. But traditionally, American conservatism is very rights-centered. It's focused on natural rights that, we as humans are endowed by our creators. It's in our, as early as our Declaration of Independence, and even further that with the Enlightenment. But it's a real focus on rights. So, I have the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. For European conservatisms, it's actually not really rights focused. It's much more focused on duty. So just as a comparison, I think in a lot of ways, whereas an American would say, I have a right to life, a European conservative would say, you have a duty not to harm someone else. And while practically that may end up being the same, there's actually somewhat of a very different philosophical underpinning. Because when you talk about duties, it's less of a privilege, it's not, or less of an entitlement than a rights approach. It's that you don't assume you have these rights. Rather that you are expected to uphold duties which protect other people, which essentially protect their rights. Another example is, I heard this all the time, is that government's a necessary evil. You probably hear that a lot in American circles. I know I still do even today. To a European conservatism, that's a very weird idea, because to them, a government's actually fundamentally good. They do not think government's evil. Now, they would say government can be evil, but they would say that government actually is a fundamentally good thing. They are strongly based on order and obedience. For example, I believe Roger Scrutin said the highest trait a human can express is obedience, because to him, that was the one trait that truly distinguished man from animal, was this actual concept of self-obedience. Another example is free markets. So, like I said, I mentioned this, a lot of people, when you ask them why they're a conservative, it comes down to the free market. I'm here to conserve the free market. And in a sense, that's the end. Like, as long as there's a free market, they're fine. The European conservative, much different. Generally, they are, I would say, tend to lean towards free markets, but free markets are a means. They choose free markets because they believe it will lead to prosperity. But as soon as the free market starts hurting cultural, social, or other factors, they put brakes on the free market. So for them, the free market is a tool. It's not the goal in and of itself. Another important example is a lot of Americans, like I said, I think this is actually changing a lot in America, believe that the government should be neutral. So for example, a lot of the people who are anti-critical race theory, they're like, critical race theory shouldn't be taught in schools. Schools need to be neutral, where essentially no values are taught. To the European conservatism, they would not argue for a value-free education. Rather, they would simply argue it's not critical race theory that needs to be taught. It's conservative values that need to be taught. So for them, government cannot be neutral. Government will almost always take a side, and they argue that we should be ensuring the government takes our side. Another difference is how in America, especially, we're very constitution centered. That, the Constitution is the end all be all. It is the very fabric of what our society is built on to many conservatives. This is a really weird concept to Europeans, because of course they don't have the long history of the Constitution that we do. Most of them, their Constitution is less than 100 years old. And they're also nations that, have existed for 1,000+ years. So it's ridiculous for them to tie their social, cultural, really their whole entity to a constitution when they know that they were around much longer than a constitution. So for them, they usually center it on the nation. So this is why they tend to call themselves nationalists, whereas typical American conservatives call themselves patriotic. Because what does that really mean? It means you're loyal to the Constitution, whereas European conservatisms are loyal to the nation. So it's a much more nation-centered approach. Another difference is the separation between church and state. And like I said, and this is a concept that I think, like I said, I think conservatives in America do differ on it. But in general, most conservatives, I think, still would say they believe in separation of church and state. But for European conservatives, they actually believe in a strong alliance between the between church and state. They believe they're partners that need to work together. And finally, I would say American conservatism can best be defined as classically liberal. Whereas European conservatism, you can define, I would say, either call it illiberal or post-liberal, where it's actually in a lot of ways rejected even the conservative classical liberal approach to how society is governed. So this is kind of what I'm talking about when we're talking about European conservatism and how it differs. And once again, the European conservatism on all these areas, they take this approach because their goal is to protect that which is true, good, and beautiful. And that's why they've taken this approach a little bit differently than American conservatism. To kind of go into this difference, I'm quoting from now the Prime Minister of Hungary. Most of you probably have heard his name, Viktor Orban. He is one of the most controversial figures, I would say, on the world stage. He is loved by many and hated by many more. But he distinguished between European and American essentially liberal and illiberal conservatism as this. In a liberal system, society and nation are nothing but an aggregation of competing individuals. What holds them together is the Constitution and the market economy. There is no nation, or if there is, it is only a political nation. Where there is no nation, there is no community and no community interest. In contrast to this, the illiberal or national viewpoint states that the nation is a historically and culturally determined community. It is a historically developed configuration which must protect its members and prepare them to stand their ground in the world for a common cause. So you can kind of see some of the points that I was talking about in the last slide iterated once again in this specific quote. He ties even classical liberalism, which he would also connect with progressive liberalism, as centered around the Constitution and the free market. His system, and like I said, when I say illiberal, that's not an insult. Orban calls it illiberal. So, he really coined that term. It's really copyrighted to him. So it's not a derogatory term to call Hungary an illiberal democracy. He calls it that himself. But the illiberal democracy is much more focused on cultural and historically determined community. And like I said, you can see with that approach, goes back once again to Roger Scrutin's approach, that conservatism means preserving that which was given to your ancestors. So that's what he's talking about when he talks about a historical and culturally determined community. It is about protecting the values that, your forefathers handed down to you. And it is centered around, especially in Hungary and in Europe, the nation itself. So let's actually talk about European conservatism in action. We're going to be talking about Hungary today, but it's worthy to note that the two best examples of European conservatism in Europe is in Poland and Hungary. Poland has been ruled by the Law and Justice Party since 2015, while Hungary has been ruled by the Fidesz and the Christian Democratic National Party since 2010. As those dates might imply, the reason I think it's a little bit more fruitful to focus on Hungary is they've now had 12 years to really enact a conservative agenda, whereas Poland has only had around 7. And frankly, Poland really just copies a lot of what Hungary does. So I think Hungary is a little bit more of a useful example, though Poland is another really great case study. So let's talk about why Hungary is such a great example of European conservatism. How did it become this? Because actually 15 years ago, they were ruled by a socialist government, which was actually a direct successor to the Communist Party that ruled Hungary. So it by no means was predetermined that Hungary would be this conservative bastion. So after the fall of the Cold War in 1990, Hungary went back and forth between the Socialist Party, which, like I said, was the successor to the Communist Party. They removed one letter in their name, and that was as much change as they felt was warranted to change from a Communist Party to a Socialist Party. It was one letter. So control went back and forth between them and Fidesz, led by Viktor Orban. So Viktor Orban actually was prime minister before 2010. He ruled a government from 1998 to 2002, but was defeated in 2002, where the socialists came to power. So this back and forth between Fidesz and the socialists finally ended in 2006, when the prime minister, who was the socialist, Ferenc Gyurcsány, who is pictured here, was actually caught at a party conference, telling the party conference how the party had lied to Hungary, how they had lied about all their promises, and that they were actually ruining the country. And it was his attempt to, I guess, rally them and be like, we need to actually do something. But once it got out, Hungarians were furious. They went to protests. And this actually ended up being, they protested on the 50th anniversary of the 1956 revolution, where Hungarians rose against the communists. And when they protested, the socialist government actually brutally suppressed the protest in 2006. So you literally have 50 years after the communists suppressed the Hungarian freedom fighters. You had the Hungarian successors suppressing and violently, putting down protests against them on the anniversary of 1956. So this completely destroyed the socialist hold on the country. And in 2010, Fidesz won a 2/3 majority. And let that sink in. I mean, imagine, I don't know when the last time any party in the United States held a 2/3 majority in just one of the houses. But in Hungary, it's unicameral, so there's only one house. The Fidesz secured a 2/3 majority, and they have held that 2/3 majority to this day. And this 2/3 majority gave them the very important power of being able to actually establish a new constitution for Hungary. At this time, even in 2010, Hungary was still using an amended version of the socialist constitution of 1949. So the constitution that Stalin forced on the Hungarians were still using an amended version in 2010. So Fidesz, and one of their first things, decided Hungary needs a new constitution. So they established a new constitution called the Fundamental Law in 2010. I believe it was put into practice on April 25th, 2011. And this would actually reframe Hungary on the conservative trajectory known today. And so I'm just going to bring some quotes from the preamble to the Hungarian constitution. As I go over this, I want you to compare this to our preamble, or just our constitution in general, because this is going to really reinforce when I talk about how European conservatism doesn't believe the government can be neutral. Because if we talk about the American Constitution, it's fairly neutral because it essentially forbids the government from doing anything in a lot of cases. The Hungarian Constitution does not do this. So let's talk about some quotes. This is all in the preamble. One of the first statements in the preamble is, "We are proud that our king, Saint Stephen, built the Hungarian state on solid ground and made our country a part of Christian Europe 1,000 years ago. We recognize the role of Christianity in preserving nationhood. We value the various religious traditions of the country. We hold that individual freedom can only be complete in cooperation with others. We hold that the family and nation constitute the principal framework of our coexistence, and that our fundamental cohesive values are fidelity, faith, and love. We hold that after the decades of the 20th century, which led to a state of moral decay, we have an abiding need for spiritual and intellectual renewal. We trust in a jointly shaped future and the commitment of younger generations. We believe that our children and grandchildren will make Hungary great again with their talent, persistence, and moral strength." Let me make sure there's no other. Okay. So, like I said, think about this and compare it to the American Constitution, and you'll notice several differences. Once, this Constitution clearly establishes Christianity as a fundamental aspect of the Hungarian nation. Now, it doesn't ban other religions. Hungary is actually quite diverse. It has around 55% Catholic population, along with 20% Reformed or Calvinist. In America, they're generally Presbyterian, but they're called Reformed. They have around 5% Lutheran, 1% Unitarian, and a Jewish population. And so all of those religions are absolutely allowed and even supported by the government. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But Christianity is given its due in the Constitution. There's no question that Hungary is a Christian nation. And then notice number 3, we hold that individual freedom can only be complete in cooperation with others. So this is another big difference in European conservatism. Traditionally, in American conservatism, the individual is viewed as the basis of society. In European conservatism, the community is viewed as the fundamental basis of society, not the individual. And if it goes even further down than the community, it only goes as far as the family. So you see this different view of society where it's a communitarian view that freedom can only be complete in cooperation with others. So this is an explicit rejection of the individualism found in doctrines in America, such as libertarianism. Notice the next one. We hold the family and the nation constitute the principal framework of our coexistence. And it establishes the values of fidelity, faith, and love. So once again, this is showing that the government is not neutral, that the government's role is actively to promote these values and to promote the nation and family. And then, like I said, the one after that, it also says the government is responsible for encouraging the spiritual and intellectual renewal of a country. I mean, imagine if this was in the US, they tried to put this in the US Constitution, how much people would freak out in the United States. So like I said, this preamble and the Constitution that follows it strongly sets Hungary on a conservative footpath, regardless of the party in power, because the Constitution says that the government has to support these values. It's not a question of partisan support, it's a question of constitutional support. So I'm going to now go through some of the policies that this has now created within Hungary that might be of interest to Americans. So one of the policies Hungary is most known for is their family policy. So I'm sure many of you know is that throughout the Western world, there's a massive demographic collapse. The United States has kind of been a little bit better than Europe, but the last census even showed in the US we're facing massively declining birth rates and really declining populations and aging populations. Hungary especially. Hungary has always had a low birth rate even 50 years ago. And they're a population of around 10 million people, and now it's getting down to around 9 million. So the government has enacted wide range support for families. So I'm quoting from Katalin Novak, who is the Minister for Families, and she describes the government's measures of the past 10 years have evidently moved demographics in the right direction. The number of childbirths, abortions, and infant mortality rate, marriages, and divorces have all moved in a favorable direction. This also proves that we have made the right decision when we made family-centered governance a priority and are now on the right path. So try and think of an a current, I know we don't have a secretary for family, I don't believe so, but imagine one of our secretaries, cabinet members talking proudly about how abortions are down, marriages are up, divorces are down. So in Hungary, they've made this a priority of that it's the government's responsibility to encourage these numbers in the right direction. And they've devoted as much as 5%. I think next year is up to 8% of the entire government's budget is dedicated to their family policy. And so let's talk about the actual effects. So fertility has actually really improved under their family policy. So in Hungary, they offer massive tax breaks if you have children. And if you actually have 4 children, you no longer have to pay income tax. So, like I said, they've really strongly incentivized having children through this policy. They also offer loans to people who have kids. So if you have 1 or 2 kids, they offer a loan. And then if you have 3 kids, they forgive the loan. If you need to expand your house to make room for children, the government offers special loans for that. So you see all of these policies, which are incredibly pro-family, have actually reaped some effort. So if you look at this graph, in 2010, the fertility rate in Hungary hit an all-time low of almost 1.2. Now, in order for a population to grow, they need around 2.1. So in the last 10 years, you've actually seen a remarkable increase in the fertility rate in Hungary. Now, it is nowhere near growth, so there is still a lot to be done. But if you look at it in comparison to what it was before, this is a remarkable improvement in just the last 10 years. Another example is marriages. The government strongly encourages marriage as a precursor for encouraging childbirth. I see here even on Facebook, I get Hungarian ads, and I get ads from the family ministry, and they'll show, a couple meeting and getting married and then having kids. So the idea of marriage is always tied into this. So it's not this, you just need to have kids and it doesn't matter if you're married or not. Marriage is heavily, heavily supported by the government in both rhetoric, where you'll have the prime minister talk about how marriage is the basis of, society. But then also in policy where married couples, are given priority in all of these family policies. So you've actually seen marriages double over the last 10 years. In 2010, there was an average of around 35 to 40,000 marriages. And in 2019, there was over 65,000 marriages. So like I say, you see almost a 2 times increase. And despite that, where you would expect with the rise of marriage, you would expect a rise in divorce, divorce has actually fallen completely. And it is actually at the same point it was in around 1962. So think about that. I mean, they have pushed divorce back to 1962 while increasing marriage. Abortion is another success story of their family policy. They have managed in the past 10 years to have abortions. And they have done this through a very strong rhetoric of encouraging adoption, encouraging alternatives to abortion. Now, I do need to put a little bit of salt in this, is that Hungary actually still has fairly liberal abortion laws. They do not have the Texas style abortion bans. They don't, or even in Poland, Poland has much stricter abortion laws than Hungary does. So so Hungary still has a little bit of ways to go when it comes to abortion. They still allow too many abortions. But through rhetoric alone, they have really marked a solid decrease in the number of abortions while the fertility rate has increased. So even though more kids are being born, less are being aborted. And to me, so much of this is actually just comes from the government rhetoric, that you have the government actively encouraging all of this, that they portray it as a good thing to get married and have children. And like I said, these European conservative governments, to move on to economic policy, the European conservatism, while they don't view the free market as an end, they do still tend to strongly lean towards free market principles, especially when it comes to welfare. So the Hungarian government has taken the approach of workfare, not welfare. Instead of building a large welfare state that many countries in Europe have, they have consistently tied poverty to employment, and their method of getting people out of poverty is finding them a job, getting them trained, and sending them into the work environment, not a broad welfare state that encourages unemployment. And you can actually see from here, in 2010, when the government came into power, the unemployment was around 10 to 11%, so quite high. Before COVID, they had brought it down to 3.5%. I believe that was even better than during the Trump's record low unemployment in the United States. So you can see a really remarkable decline in unemployment over the last 10 years through their shrewd economic policy. And let's be clear, they were also fiscal conservatives, because in 2010, the IMF basically owned Hungary. The socialist government had run the government into so much debt that essentially you had IMF people coming to Budapest every month. They were basically being told what to do. But when Fidesz came in, they came in with strong fiscal responsibility, and they were able to completely, reduce debt, reduce unemployment, and lead to remarkable economic growth. So you also have to keep in mind, when Fidesz came into power in 2010, the world was still in recession. There were still the crises to come, the Euro crisis. And they were able to do a great job of steadying Hungary throughout this period, and now have led Hungary to a remarkable period of growth. For example, this year, their recovery is going to be around 7.6%, which is a remarkable growth for a country whose population is declining. So this growth is even more remarkable when you take into the fact that the population is declining, and yet economic growth on average in the last 5 years was around 3 to 4%. So they've really been able to bring in and massively improve the economy using a lot of the tactics that American conservatives would still support. But for example, if you notice with the family policy, just because they do support the free market, that does not mean that they are for limited government. The family policy is not limited government at all. It's strong government intervention into the economy. And so now we're going to go into talking about the relationship between the church and state. This actually was from their kind of Independence Day. It was the anniversary of St. Stephen's accession. He was their first Christian king. So in August of this year, they had massive celebrations, massive fireworks, and it ended with a giant cross being lit over the parliament. Like I said, imagine if Trump lit a giant cross over the White House, how that would have gone down. So Viktor Orban has consistently supported a strong alliance between the church and the state. Quoting from him, "The second task we have is to ensure that future generations are Christian and Hungarian. And these two tasks, church and state, are allies for each other. Therefore, when the state gives resources to build or maintain a church institution, it is putting the money in the best place. So when he's talking about the state giving resources, Hungary has done an amazing job of restoring, rebuilding, and supporting the building of new churches throughout Hungary. During the communist period, churches were repressed severely, and so the government believes it's responsible to essentially make up for the repression that churches faced during the communist period. So they've done a great work of, like I said, really restoring church buildings, supporting them in all manners, supporting the return of schools to churches. Before the communist period, almost all schools in Hungary were church run, but the communists nationalized all the schools. After that, like I said, once Fidesz got into power, they've really tried to bring back church-run schools as a method of ensuring that future generations are Christian and Hungarian. And like I said, this is still all part of the Scrutin-esque values of trying to preserve that which is good, true, and beautiful. Hungarians believe Christianity is true, good, and beautiful, so therefore they believe they are responsible, and their government is responsible for ensuring the next generation is both Christian and Hungarian. And like I said, this isn't just limited to Christianity. Synagogues throughout Hungary are being rebuilt and restored along with churches. So this is not a complete, this isn't a theocracy. This isn't a discriminatory system against other religions, but it is a recognition that Christianity and Judaism are traditional religions in Hungary and need to be supported through resources given by the state. Another important topic that actually kind of really brought Hungary into the focus is immigration. Before even Trump was president, in 2015, there was a massive immigration crisis to Europe, and Hungary was one of the only countries that actually built an entire wall on its border in order to stop the immigration flow. And so that was really one of the first times Hungary came into the news, was their very swift and severe response to immigration. So, and this is another area where we're going to see, as I read these quotes, where you're going to see European conservatism really differ from American. Because even I would say the strongest, closed border American conservative still supports the idea of limited immigration, that, immigrants do provide a value. And of course, how can we deny, I doubt there's an American today who doesn't have immigrant ancestry. But in Hungary, where you don't really have that history, they have a much more severe approach to immigration than even strict American conservatives. So here's a quote from Orban. "We are living in times when fewer and fewer children are being born throughout Europe. They say that the shortfall should be made up by immigrants, and then the numbers will be in order. We do not need numbers, but Hungarian children. In our minds, immigration means surrender. If we resign ourselves to the fact that we are unable to sustain ourselves, even biologically, by doing so, we admit that we are not important even for ourselves. The fate of such peoples is slow but certain obliteration." So you see him tying immigration, in a sense, into family policy, because that is all in reaction to the declining population of Hungarians. So Orban believes, and European conservatives in general, that since Europe's population is declining, this is the worst time to bring in immigrants, because immigrants really can only come in when your population is growing and they can assimilate. But since Europe's population is declining, this is really the worst time to do that. So he takes essentially a zero immigration approach to Hungary. He really does not want any non-European immigration to Hungary at all. So you'll find this approach actually much stricter than, I would say, even very strong anti-immigrant American conservatives. Just to show you, when I'm talking about zero immigrants, this is actually a graph of number of migrants during the 2015 migrant crisis. I don't know if you guys can tell or can guess when the wall was built and finished, but you actually see a decline in daily crossings from 8,000, 5,000, 6,000 to basically zero once they successfully built a wall along their border with Serbia, which is where the migrants were trying to get into Hungary. So like I said, he built the wall before really Trump even claimed to attempt to build the wall. So he really was actually kind of a pioneer in the intent to build walls to stop immigration. Another interesting topic that I like talking about when we talk about European conservatism is their focus on aesthetics, which is actually a really new topic that, I think 10 or 15 years ago, no one would have ever considered architecture being political. But to European conservatives, architecture and aesthetics and art are all very political. They believe that architecture is an expression of public politics. And therefore, when we're talking about architecture, that needs to be included into political discussions. So to quote from Roger Scrutin, who, if you're ever talking about architecture, you really can't go without him. He was first and foremost expert of aesthetics. And so architecture art was really his first love. He talks about how there is a deep human need for beauty. And if you ignore that need in architecture, your buildings will not last. So him and European conservatism takes the approach that buildings, and modern buildings in particular, are actually expressions of progressive ideology, which is interesting to think about, because I don't know if you guys have ever truly considered why all of our modern day buildings are ugly, which, let's face it, they are. Why do people travel to Venice or Europe in general from America? Is to see these beautiful buildings that existed and that we don't have in the US. Because unfortunately, we're a newer country, and frankly, we destroyed a lot of our older architecture willingly. We're missing out of the beauty of actually having beautiful buildings. So European conservatives generally include architecture when they're talking about public policy. So they support government mandates for classical architecture. A picture I have right here is actually a building in front of the Hungarian parliament. The building above was built during the socialist time period, incredibly ugly. And around 10 years ago, after Fidesz came into power, they changed it to the building below. And actually, the building below, it's not a restoration. This building never existed before. So they actually built an entirely new classical building over the facade of this ugly communist era building, which is really rare these days. Usually when classical buildings are being built in Europe, they're only restorations, a rebuilding of something that was there before. Here we actually have something entirely new being built in the classical style. Just some other examples. In Budapest, there's a castle district, which contained a lot of historical palaces. But during World War II, there was fierce fighting, and they were all destroyed either by that fighting or after World War II, the communists destroyed a lot of palaces because, they were of the old aristocrats, and the communists wanted to get rid of them. So on the right, you see the Archduke Francis's palace, which is currently being rebuilt in Hungary. They are rebuilding this entire palace. And on the left, just to show you the difference, this concrete looking building to the left, on the left picture, is what the left-wing opposition wanted to build instead of the palace. This weird concrete, square looking thing instead of the palace. Because, for European conservatives, it is important to connect with our architectural heritage, because if we're trying to protect that which is true, good, and beautiful from our ancestors, that includes buildings. Because who can honestly argue that the building on the right isn't more beautiful than the building on the left? 90% of people, I would say, would argue the building on the right is the most beautiful. And therefore, we have a responsibility to preserve this beauty that we have in buildings given to us by our ancestors. Another key area is education. So Hungary actually has a very similar system to the United States, where their education is still dominated largely by left-leaning academia. So in recent years, the government's taken a very innovative approach of actually privatizing organizations and giving them to foundations. So this is actually very similar to how a lot of American universities are run. They're run by a foundation. And their attempt is to give these universities to foundations that understand what universities are truly meant for. So this education bill, which established the transferring of public universities to private foundations, established that the fundamental expectation is that the foundations actively defend the survival and well-being of the nation and the interests of enriching its intellectual treasures. So this is an attempt to essentially kind of reclaim the universities from the left-leaning academia and direct them towards actually defending the survival and well-being of the nation. So it's an attempt to reorient universities from a left-wing bias towards a more conservative bias. And this is actually one of the more recent policies. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this actually ends up working in the next 10 years. So is this the future of American conservatism? Some might argue that this already is American conservatism. You know, some of you might look at what I've talked about and hate it. You prefer what American conservatism was 10 years ago. But the fact is that this is quickly becoming a strong contender for American conservatism. Most recently, Tucker Carlson went to Budapest and sung the praises of the government's policies there. You have other Americans like Patrick Deneen, you know, who I had the chance of meeting in Budapest. Rod Dreher has been to Budapest. A lot of Americans are coming to Hungary to learn how things are done here. And whether you like it or not, they're coming back to America with these ideas. So it's important to understand what European conservatism is and understand whether or not this is a viable path for American conservatism, which is why it's important for us to understand what's happening in Hungary, understand what works, because I've talked a lot about the successes today, I'll admit that. But there are also a lot of areas that don't end up not working, that they've done wrong. Like I said, they have 2 liberal abortion laws. So it's important to understand what Hungary does and understand, are there lessons there that we as Americans can learn? So that's why I think it's very important. And that's kind of why I think it's important to have this lecture and for you guys to understand it so that you can understand this, you know, understand whether or not you want this to be the future of American conservatism. And now I'm going to recommend, if you guys want to learn more about what European conservatism is about, here's a couple of good reading materials. I've already mentioned Roger Scrutin's How to Be a Conservative. I strongly recommend The Demon in Democracy by Ryszard Legutko. To me, he is the epitome of European conservatism. If you read that, he strongly connects the notion of liberal democracy and frankly, liberalism in general with communism. He doesn't say that communism is liberalism, but he says liberalism uses a lot of the same tactics and is the same utopian ideology that is a similar utopian ideology as communism. And I recommend Patrick J. Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed. He's an American, so I guess I shouldn't really call him a European conservatism, but he really articulates the post-liberal position, the illiberal position well. So I think reading his book is very important to understand European conservatism. And finally, with regards to websites and monthly publications, I recommend the Hungarian Conservative and the European Conservative. They both have online articles and websites that you can follow, but they are both pretty much the main venues for Americans, because they're in English, to understand European and Hungarian conservatism. So with that, that kind of concludes my presentation. So I hope it was useful, and I'm excited to hear if you guys have any questions that I'd love to answer and maybe have a little bit of a discussion.
We do have a couple questions that we kind of pre-prepared that some of the executive board just not wanted to ask. The first one's going to be, what is the biggest obstacle that the Hungarian conservative government faces today?
There's a couple of opposite obstacles they face. They have an election coming up in April, and this will be the closest election in the last 12 years because the opposition, which was always disunited, so in the last elections, Fidesz would always get around 50% of the vote, but since the opposition was divided amongst 4 parties, that's how they were always able to win 2/3 of the seat. The opposition parties, which range from left-wing socialists to actually far-right fascist parties, have all united into one opposition party. And so now it's kind of going to be a 2-party system in the next election. And the polls actually are somewhat close. So their main obstacle is actually to win the next election, which I always point out to those who accuse Hungary of not being a democracy. As you talk to anybody in the government here, they're worried about the next election. Not they think they'll win still, but the fact that they think there's a chance they might not, shows that Hungary is still a democracy. They also face outside pressure. So especially under the Biden administration, Orban was one of the few international leaders to actively support Trump and say he supported Trump to win. A lot of that was because under Obama, Orban faced consistent pressure and essentially a refusal on the American part to work productively with Hungary. They consistently condemned Hungarian actions. They condemned the new constitution Hungary brought in. So they face a lot of pressure from that, from the US, and then also from the EU. So for those who don't know, Hungary is a part of the EU, and it faces even stronger pressure within the EU, especially over issues like LGBT issues. Hungary recently passed a law that prohibited talking about homosexuality and transgenderism to school students because they believe that only parents have the right to talk to their children about those issues. The EU Parliament strongly condemned them. They are attempting to withhold funding to Hungary over this. And so that's kind of one of their, I would say, their main issues is that they have an election coming up that will be fairly close. And then you also have this outside pressure from the EU and from the US. So those are major obstacles the government currently faces right now.
All right, all right. The next question is going to be, what is the American right doing wrong in its attempts to attract voters, specifically from younger generations?
So that's a good question. It's difficult because I'll be honest, the youth in Hungary are somewhat liberal. The attempt at fixing the universities is the Hungarian attempt to save the youth. I don't know if that's one of the things we're gonna have to wait and see if that actually works, because most of the opposition, left-wing opposition, is young people, even in Hungary. So I think really what the right in America does wrong is it's changing, and I'll admit it's changing, is understanding what the real goal is. So you still have this devotion to things like the free market. And look, I think the free market's great. I think the free market's an example of excellent, I think the free market brings prosperity, and I think that's great. But you still have a refusal on a lot of the American right to understand that the free market is not the end all be all. If the free market starts hurting our society, we need to put reins on the free market. And that's okay. And essentially we need to move past the idea, and we are now, that big business is our friend, because, under Reagan policy, we enriched all these great corporations that are now woke and censoring, suppressing and firing conservative voices. So we've essentially become, these corporations are essentially, in a lot of cases, the establishment GOP's pimp, where they abuse them. So I think that's an issue, but ultimately I think we need to take the institutional approach. The fact that you have incredibly conservative states where they have universities that have DEI, departments, and that this is all from state funding, is Republicans need to wake up and realize that, one, the government's not neutral, and we have to take an institutional approach to this, and the government has to take a side, because the left is going to use the government, so the right needs to too. So I would say, especially when it comes to states, we need to start going after the universities and start essentially trying to deprogram, these universities away from being indoctrinating machines, which is what they are today. So that's, I think, some lessons that the American right could learn.
All right, all right. Does anyone have any questions in the Zoom audience? There's a question from Philip in the chat. What does Hungarian retirement policies look like?
So they have a strong pension program. Like I said, when I say they don't have a big welfare state, we would consider them having a big welfare state just because, they have a small welfare state for Europe, not for us. So for example, they have a very strong pension program and retirement program. So they do have a lot of welfare in that regard. And for example, they have socialized healthcare, and Orban has made no attempt to privatize healthcare, because that would just immediately lose him the election. That would be the equivalent of a Republican trying to ban guns. That's so entrenched in Hungarian, sense of, what is normal is to have socialized healthcare. So they do a lot for retirement, but just as another example, in their constitution, they actually establish that children have a constitutional obligation to take care of their parents. So that's sometimes how specific the constitution gets in attempting to protect the organization of Hungarian society. Children are constitutionally obligated to care for their parents. And likewise, parents are obligated to care for their children. So they do have a strong retirement and pension program. And there's also these constitutional obligations of children to protect the welfare of their parents in retirement.
All right, we have one other question from our club members. I'll let him ask it himself.
Now, I don't know if this is an issue in Hungary, but is there a problem with monopolies or certain corporations or hospitals or things like that taking control of systems or institutions, locking other smaller businesses out? How do we deal with that?
So really the Orban has done a lot of battle with businesses, but they mostly have been in the case of foreign businesses. So after the Cold War, a lot of Western companies, especially German, French, came in and bought up all the companies that were being privatized in Hungary. Media companies, telecommunications, they're all basically German owned. And a lot of what Orban's done, and he's been accused of giving companies to his friends, essentially. But the reason he's doing that is because he's actually taking these companies out of foreign owned hands and giving them to people who are Hungarian, so that they actually have, and these Hungarians are actually, responsible to Hungary, because when you're Hungarian, you actually have, there's much more oversight that can be given than how is Hungary going to hold a German, media tycoon responsible? He's in Germany, he's responsible to German law, not Hungarian law. So there's not widespread monopoly. I would say most of those kind of battles have actually been Orban's attempt to bring these companies just in Hungarian ownership. And to be fair, he has given them to a lot of his allies. So there is absolutely, in that sense, corruption, where a lot of his allies have been given control of companies, media. He's done, especially with the media. They accuse Hungary of not having free media. And while I would say the government does favor right-wing media, it's still around 50-50, where 50% of the media is left-wing, 50% of the media is right-wing. I personally think the media is just used to having like 80 or 90% controlled by left-wing. For them, 50-50 means they're being oppressed. So he has done a lot of approach. But like I said, most of the monopolies he's fought have been foreign owned rather than domestically Hungarian owned. Because, it's not like the US where you can have these giant monopolies, because Hungary is only a country of 10 million. So if there's any giant monopoly to be worried about, it's a foreign one. And Orban definitely takes the approach of favoring and supporting Hungarian businesses in that regard.
All right. We have one last question from our members in the club. I'll let her ask it.
Hi, so I'm not sure how much you're going to be able to answer this, but you spoke earlier to the changes in Hungarian adoption that has helped reduce the number of abortions over the last 10 years. How would you compare that to US adoption systems, if you were able to speak to that?
Unfortunately, I am not able to speak. I don't know really much about the US adoption. Unfortunately, at this part, I probably know more about Hungary than I do the United States. But like I said, to me, a large portion of this is really just rhetoric alone, because right now we have a government that absolutely encourages the idea of abortion, and so really, I think just really through rhetoric alone, the government has really been able to, make it easy to adopt, just establish the idea that adoption's an option. And like I said, and adoption's also gone under flack because they have restricted adoption. So one area they have restricted adoption is they've restricted it to married couples. And if you're single, you have to get written authorization from the actual ministry, Katlin Novak, the Minister for Families, for a single person to adopt children. So in that sense, it has been restricted somewhat, but they've made the system for married couples that much easier. A lot of the reason they have done that, like I said, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, is they have done that to ensure same-sex couples can't adopt children, because same-sex marriage is not recognized in Hungary. So when you make it so only married couples can adopt, that de facto leaves out same-sex couples. So it's not legally leaving out same-sex couples, it's de facto leaving out same-sex couples. So that's kind of how their adoption laws are organized, at least right now. But they definitely, like I said, have a strong, just through encouraging adoption. And even things like infertility. They've done a lot of supportive research into infertility, just to make it so Hungarian women who struggle with that issue have access to some of the leading practices to help, increase fertility amongst women.
All right, well, that's going to be the last question for us. It's been extremely enlightening. Everyone's enjoyed it here. I'm guessing everyone enjoyed it over Zoom. So yeah, that'll be the conclusion. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. Like I said, I hope it was helpful. If anybody has any questions, Brandon can give out my information, and I'm sure happy to continue this discussion on other forums. So thank you very much for the invite.
Definitely. We'll have to have you back at some point, big guy.